All right, here we go with another example of chapter 4.5 of phase shift. This time we're going to do a cosine curve. So a cosine curve, cosine function. So here it is. Here's the function that we've been given. Y equals 3 cosine 2x minus pi over 2. So we've got a phase shift now. So we can start answering the simple questions here. One is, what is the amplitude? Well, again, the amplitude is always this first number out here, and that's 3, so we get an amplitude of 3. Period, we can find the period by 2 pi over b. Well, the b value is right here. It's always in front of the x, so that value is 2, so we can take 2 pi over 2, which will then cancel, and we get a period of just pi. Now, we come to the phase shift. And again, the phase shift we can find by taking the inner part of the parentheses and set that equal to 0. So here we have 2x minus pi over 2 equals 0. We get 2x equals pi over 2, and we subtract pi over 2 from both sides, and then we divide by 2 when we get x equals pi over 4. Alright, so we now are ready to start looking at how to graph this thing and some values. We need to plug in some values into our max, 0, min, 0, max, the 5 key points. And so we understand from before that wherever that phase shift is, that's the new start or that new 0. So I know that since my phase shift was at pi over 4, that's going to be where my first max is. So that's at pi over 4. Now I need to find out where this last max is. So I'm going to scoot this over a bit so we can do some work on this side to find these values. So it's pi over 4. We have a period of pi. So we need to find out where this last max is. So we'll take pi over 4 plus pi. Now, I'm going to turn pi into terms of 4. So I'll take 4 pi over 4, and we get 5 pi over 4. So our last max is at 5 pi over 4. It's just the phase shift plus the period, and we get our last max. Now I've got to do the middle part, and that's find the averages, or half. So what we can do is if we add these two together and divide by 2, and in these cases I like to multiply by 1/2. It makes the math a little easier. So we get 1/2 pi over 4 plus 5 pi over 4. Well, 5 pi over 4 plus 1 pi over 4 is 6 pi over 4. So if I take 1/2 of 6 pi over 4, I can now simplify 2 and 6. So that makes 3 pi over 4. So I'll get 3 pi over 4. Well, you might be able to see this pattern now. If this is pi over 4 and it is symmetrical, and the spacing is the same, this would be 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, and 5 pi over 4. So 2 pi over 4 would reduce to pi over 2. I can do it algebraically as well. Again, let me show you. 1/2 of pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4 plus 1 pi over 4 is 4 pi over 4. So we get 1/2 times 4 pi over 4. And again, those 4's would cancel, so we end up with pi over 2. Now this 3 pi over 4, this should be 4 pi over 4. But 4 pi over 4 is really just pi, right? I want to encourage you to pause the video now, do it algebraically, and see if you come up with the same answer. All right, we're back. So let's see. 1/2 plus 3 times 3 pi over 4 plus 5 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4 plus 5 pi over 4. Well, that's 8 pi over 4, or really 2 pi, so 1/2 times 2 pi. And again, we can cancel the 2's, they simplify out, and we're just left with pi. So congratulations if you got pi, that is absolutely correct. Nice work. Well, let's set up our graph now. Our first thing here is at, our first point is at pi over 4, so I'm going to put pi over 4 there. And then we go to pi over 2, and then 3 pi over 4, and then there's good old pi, and finally 5 pi over 4. Again, I set up my max and min, my boundaries here, my amplitude. So this is what I like to do, just to remind me where these boundaries are. At +3 and -3. And then I'm going to draw my curve, fill in my curve. Well, at pi over 4, we have a maximum. So this is a cosine curve, so we start with a max. Pi over 2, we have a 0. So I'll fill in my 0. At 3 pi over 4, we have a minimum. So that'll be down there. And then at pi, we have another 0. And at 5 pi over 4, we are back up top with a max. And we make a nice, smooth curve. Should not be in the form of a V. Probably a little bit more elegant than that, but that's okay. It's just a sketch, okay? Anyway, hope you had a good time with this. Go back and re-review it. This is cosine with a phase shift. Thank you.